Good afternoon and welcome to the Full Scottish. My name is Brian Liddy. It's Sunday, the 6th of October, and I'm pleased to say I'm joined in the studio today by Linda Fabiani. Linda Fabiani. Sorry, Drew. Linda, you are a retired SNP MSP and held various important positions when you were in Holyrood. Thank you for joining us. And Drew, you're the previous SNP MP for Inverness, Nairn, Badenoch and Strathspey. Thank you also for giving us up a huge chunk of your weekend.
How are you? Pleasure.
Both? Thank you.
Yeah, very well, thank you. Yeah, looking forward to taking part today.
Me too. I think it's a good running order today, so I'm looking forward to it too. So we'll start, sadly, with Ukraine update for day 956. Ukrainian forces said they shot down a Russian warplane in Ukraine's east on Saturday. The bomber was downed near the city of Kostyantynivka in Donetsk region, according to the head of the region's military administration, Yuri Horbunov. Ukraine said 5 civilians were killed by Russian shelling in the country's south and east. Russian forces captured the village of Zelandruj in the Donetsk region, Moscow's defense ministry claimed on Saturday. The village is located close to Pokrovsk, a logistics hub for the Ukrainian army that is threatened by the advance of Russian troops. If confirmed, the village's capture would come 3 days after Ukrainian forces said they were withdrawing from the frontline town of Vuhledar, about 35 kilometres from Zelandruj, after a hard-fought 2-year defence. Volodymyr Zelensky said he would present his victory plan at the 12th of October meeting of the Ramstein Group of Nations that supplies arms to Ukraine. The plan had clear, concrete steps towards a just end to the war, the Ukrainian president said on X on Saturday, adding that the 25th Ramstein meeting would be the first to take place at the leaders' level. Russia launched 3 guided missiles and 13 attack drones at Ukraine overnight into Saturday, Ukraine's Air Force said. The missiles were intercepted, 3 drones were shot down over the Odessa region, and 10 others were lost, it said. Russia's defense ministry said on Saturday that air defences shot down 10 Ukrainian drones overnight in 3 border regions, including 7 over the Belgorod region, 2 over the Kursk region, and 1 over the Voronezh region. Ukrainian prosecutors said they were investigating allegations Russian forces executed 4 Ukrainian prisoners of war, and said a possible suspect for the killings was in custody. The servicemen are alleged to have been killed on the orders of Russian military command over the summer at an aggregate plant in Vovchansk, which has been the focus of fierce fighting. The Russian prosecutors called for a 70-year sentence at the trial of a US citizen accused of fighting as a mercenary in Ukraine against Russia. The US Embassy in Moscow said it was aware of the reports of an American citizen's arrest, but could not comment further due to privacy restrictions. Linda, I'm going to come to you first and ask, are you beginning to tire of being asked to kind of make some kind of comment about the Ukraine update after 900 and how many days was it? 956?
Yeah. I'm certainly not tiring of being asked. I'm tiring of the fact that this has just been going on so long because, every day this goes on, there's more people badly affected, there's people killed, there's people made homeless, people living through terrible stress and strain. And the fact that it's gone on so long, I'm quite concerned that when I read that the Russians had taken Vuhledar after 2 years of defence by Ukraine, I found that quite depressing, quite concerning. And when I read into it more, what bothered me about it too was some of the comments that were coming from the Ukrainian military, who really seemed to be just completely bowed down with the stress and strain of everything that's going on. And some of them are actually starting to say things against the leadership, and that's always a worrying thing for morale. Also, I'm really interested in hearing what President Zelensky's plan is that he's going to put forward on the 12th of October. I just wonder if there is a turn going on here, and it'll be interesting to see what comes out about that, because they're really up against it, and it's awful.
Thank you, Linda. Drew, I mean, again, are you beginning to tire of being asked by me and people like me about what's going on in Ukraine?
No, actually, I think one of the things that's very commendable about what you're doing on this show is actually raising it, because part of the problem, I think, for people who've been illegally invaded, as the people of Ukraine have been, is that once you start to be forgotten, that support, that political support, that impetus behind making sure that the right decisions are making tends to dry up a bit. So I think it's good that you're continuing to do this update. I think one of the few programs that do this on a regular basis, and I think people should be aware of what's happening out there. And I think, as we'll go on to discuss, there's also a real issue over the way Western diplomacy has, in some measures, done all right at times in here, but largely has failed over Ukraine for the past nearly 1,000 days, I think we came up to.
Thank you, Drew. And speaking of which, we'll move on to the update, today's update in Gaza in the Middle East. At least 41,870 Palestinians have been killed and 97,166 have been wounded in Gaza since the 7th of October. And more than 2,000 have been killed and 9,500 wounded in Lebanon. 1 year on from the October 7th, and the wider Middle East conflict is now more likely as Israel prepares to retaliate against Iran. So tomorrow is the anniversary, the first anniversary of the attacks on Israel on the 7th of October by Hezbollah, which makes today's update all the more poignant than usual. There's talk this week of it escalating beyond the borders of Israel into countries like Lebanon. Iran attacked Israel. Yeah, Lebanon already, and that's true. So Israel's attacking Lebanon. It's easy to start these conflicts, but not so easy to stop them when it spreads like that. Iran attacked Israel recently, and I'm wondering if you've any clue, Drew, I'm going to come to you first, if you have any clue as to what you think Netanyahu's next move is going to be. Do you think he would be so far as to do something as risky as attack Iran's nuclear installations, and would that mean another Chernobyl?
Well, I think one of the things that's really difficult and perhaps a wee bit dangerous to do is speculate about particularly nuclear attacks and things like that. But one thing I will say is that Netanyahu has done some pretty unimaginable things up until now. He obviously feels that one of the ways for him to retain power is to continue to do some of the things that he's doing just now. He wasn't very popular, to put it mildly, before the attacks, the hostage taking on October the 7th. And since then, I think he's used a lot of the conflict to drive his own personal position. The danger just now, when we talk about Iran, is that this is an escalation which has the potential to be extremely serious. And as you pointed out, there are connotations that involve nuclear weapons there. The real problem here is that there has been indecision, dithering, and a lack of response from, as I mentioned a few moments ago in relation to Ukraine, a lack of a cohesive Western diplomacy response to the situation since it started. We should have had a ceasefire in Gaza many months ago. There should have been a space for political dialogue to go ahead to try and find some kind of solution. That hasn't happened. And as you pointed, many more children, women and men, innocent civilians have died. Millions have now been displaced. And the situation for many people, ordinary people across the region now, is unbelievable. I think it's been described in the press as hell on earth in some cases. Now, that's not acceptable. America has completely dropped the ball. The UK has been, has failed to halt arms sales, for example, to Israel while this is going on. Some of the basic things that you would do here. So I think what we're looking at is, an expansion of the conflict just now, which is very, very hard to rein in. And I think it's becoming even more difficult now for people to see a way to calm this down before there's more significant loss of life.
Thank you, Drew. Linda, do you think, is there anything that can be done to de-escalate the conflict and stop the indiscriminate killing of civilian populations?
I think the problem with Netanyahu is that he will do anything that, in my opinion, anything to hold on to power. And he's being allowed to escalate and escalate because, as Drew said, nobody in the West, America, UK, anybody of any perceived importance has actually come out and said, no, you're totally out of order. Enough's enough here. He just seems to constantly be given leave to carry on. And now there's thousands been killed in Lebanon. And then goodness knows what he'll do in Iran. Who the heck knows? And meanwhile, I keep thinking, what's happening in the West Bank while all this cover's going on? Because the media that I am seeing is largely now talking about Lebanon, largely now talking about potential wider conflict, including Iran. Nobody seems to be talking about the link that's there with Russia and Iran, in terms of weapons supply and the effects that can have as well. And meanwhile, I'm pretty sure that going on past experience that Israel is advancing further into the West Bank and not only disenfranchising people, taking away their homes and, setting their own flags on land that they shouldn't be. We're also not hearing a terrible amount about Gaza. We're hearing it as a side issue to Lebanon at the moment. So it really requires America particularly to be coming out and saying, no, you've gone too far now. It stops. And the diplomatic, the diplomatic pressure should be put onto Israel to say, we need ceasefire. You're getting no more weapons from us because what you're doing is illegal and we cannot back you any further.
Of course, there's massive stasis in America just now in terms of their diplomatic response to Israel because they're going through the presidential election cycle just now. So you have a president in Biden who doesn't really want to make the wrong step. You've got two candidates in Trump and Harris who don't want to make the wrong step. So consequently, nobody's making any real decision. And the only country that can significantly influence the actions of Israel at the moment is the United States. So until the election is over in November, I don't think we'll see much happening there. I've got to say, my guess is that there wouldn't be much happening in terms of positive interaction on getting a solution immediately after that either. But it's certainly a time when you're looking for the US to have an influence, then I think it's hamstrung by the fact that it's going through a very, very difficult presidential election.
And there's also Brian, from a UK context, I know the UK is not a hugely important player anymore internationally, although it thinks it is, but there are still export licenses for weapons from Israel.
Exactly
Yes,
so.
they cancelled some, but they could just stop them all. Just stop them all. There's a message out to the rest of the world. And it could trigger other things as well.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Drew. And of course, you've both been highlighting what the SNP's consistent position throughout with Humza Yousaf, John Swinney and Stephen Flynn. So interesting discussion there. Thank you. So the next item is the UK economy. So this week, the UK government announced investment in carbon capture and storage projects in the north of England, but there was no mention of investment in Peterhead or Grangemouth. With news of 10% public spending cuts in the budget, Rachel Reeves is said to be rolling back on taxing non-DOMs and VAT on private schools. So I'm just a wee reminder that the Scottish Government can't put forward its budget until after Rachel Reeves has delivered her budget. And I wonder if either of you can confirm. I'm wondering, does she even get any advance notice that she has to keep private, but gives her at least a head start, or does she have to just listen and find out along with all of us when it goes out live on the news? I'm guessing Finance Minister won't be given any prior warning at all, but you can tell me otherwise. And now there's no longer a pro-indie majority in Holyrood. Will the guests, do you foresee anything especially tricky in this budget, and what would you like to see in it? Linda, I think it's your turn first. So, what's your thought about the UK Westminster budget and the oncoming then Scottish budget?
Well, first of all, you were right in saying no notice has to be given. There have been times when there has been a discussion beforehand, which is obviously confidential between governments, and it shouldn't be otherwise. But I also know that there of late there has been no notice given whatsoever. So it's a scramble for the Holyrood government to be able to get their own stuff together. I mean, Labour are just going down the Conservative path just now. They said they would, and that's what they're doing. It's the one promise they've kept, we'll stick to Tory austerity. And they've been allowed to do it with no criticism at all from their branch office, Scottish Labour. And it's the same old stuff, investment that is about servicing the south of England. The north of England suffers from that as well, although the two carbon capture plants that have been agreed are sort of further north and south. But Aberdeen, to miss out on this is just ludicrous. Nothing to be in there about Grangemouth is absolutely ludicrous, as is the things that Drew can talk about with much more knowledge than I can about our energy supplies. What Scotland needs is the ability for capital expenditure, because that can kickstart the economy and make it stronger. But that's what we're not allowed to do. Our infrastructure in Scotland has been neglected for decades. Although the popular press and media seem to be blaming the SNP government, Scottish government, for everything, we have to look past decades as to where this has been missed. And people never talk about this now, but I remember in 2007, when the SNP came into government in Scotland, John Swinney discovered well over £1 billion of money that had been left at Westminster and that the Labour Liberal Democrat coalition had never claimed to use in Scotland for capital expenditure. And that was a mark of the neglect that Scotland has had in its infrastructure over the decades. Of course, John Swinney claimed that money and used it to great effect. But we're in real dire straits at the moment as far as the income to the Scottish Government is concerned, as far as the effect on people in Scotland is concerned. So what I would like to see in the budget is the ability for capital expenditure, whether that's money that comes directly from Westminster or whether that is a further agreement on borrowing powers. I think that's what we require.
Thank you, Linda. So, Drew, Linda made mention of changes that could perhaps be made to improve things. You were in the room in Westminster when previous Tory governments overlooked Scotland's carbon capture schemes. Do you think, has Keir Starmer now simply overlooked Scotland once again?
Well, I think one of the interesting things here is that we had big arguments during the independence referendum campaign about certainty for business. And, I think we all remember back in 2012, David Cameron promising carbon capture and storage. There was that £1 billion worth of investment that was going to come forward. And one of the first things they did after the independence referendum was to effectively cancel that promise. And since then, we've had promise after promise about investment in carbon capture in the northeast, and about the fact that the UK government would support a just transition. And of course, none of that has actually been delivered yet. So we get more kind of vague promises. The difficult thing just now, I think, with these announcements is that there has been a certainty put into other areas in England, which are going to get these projects. And again, the carbon capture and storage, which is ideal, and everybody's always said it's ideal. It's the place you should start in the UK in terms of developing this. Is effectively overlooked again. Now, we've got to keep arguing for them to keep coming back and doing that. We've got to keep remembering that the Scottish Government has dipped its hand into the budget that it has to produce a £500 million transition fund for the North East to achieve that just transition, which has been left unmatched by the UK government. So, if we really want to see the protection of, Scottish business, the industry, the ability to transition away from oil and gas successfully, keeping high-skilled jobs in the northeast of Scotland, then, we absolutely need to see the delivery of some of these promises. That's not happening. And you talked about me being in the room. I was in the room as finance spokesperson for the SNP when the previous budgets were being unveiled by Jeremy Hunt. And at that time, it was quite clear, and Paul Johnson, the director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, had pointed out that there was going to be a £20 billion black hole following the fiscal rules from the UK government of the time that was going forward. And both the Labour Party and the Tory Party were in denial about the level of cuts that would be required. So this is knowledge that's been out there for some time. So the fact that we have, Rachel Reeves putting forward the fact that her hands are tied, she doesn't, she has to follow these fiscal rules, also is a problem for Scotland and problem for investment. So it's not just about carbon capture. This is a wider issue about public spending cuts that are coming forward. The ones they've got planned are already pretty horrendous, and what comes forward from there is going to be difficult. And perhaps in a minute or two, we'll come back and talk about how this could be done differently. But yeah, it is a problem. We want certainty for all kinds of business in Scotland. We want certainty for our public services. We want the ability to make sure that people don't drift into poverty and that cuts don't impact on communities. And those kinds of things can only be done by investment. And at the moment, that investment is not happening.
Thank you, Drew. Linda, I thought the First Minister made an interesting point the other day. I mean, there's no longer a pro-independent majority at Holyrood, and so therefore the budget's going to have to get support from more than one or two parties. But he said that it was, I think it was on a Radio 4 interview, that it's going to reflect really badly on pro-unionist parties in Holyrood if they fail to back the SNP's budget, because it would mean that money's not going to be forthcoming for health, for education, for infrastructure, for housing. So, I mean, how dire would that be? Would funding just stop, and what would it mean for the unionists?
Well, you would have to revert to the previous budget and carry on. I think Scottish Labour are in a really difficult position. I mean, you can more or less discount the Scottish Tories at the moment because nobody's really bothering about what the heck they're saying. The Lib Dems have become, nobody really thinks that they've got any importance. So Scottish Labour are the ones that are really up against it just now. Because they made loads of promises. Remember Anna Sarwar, there will be no austerity and all the stuff they said before the election, which has come to nothing, pile of nonsense. Now, were they lied to by their own people in Westminster? Are they now sitting there thinking, oh, wait a minute, you told us otherwise, now you're doing this, and it means we're absolutely up against it here in Scotland? Who knows? But there is dissent in the ranks. And the population in Scotland is also very disillusioned with Labour very quickly because of what they've done with the fuel grant and stuff. So, and a recognition that promises have been broken. So they're really up against it. So for Scottish Labour to work against and vote against the Scottish Government's budget, and I hope there's a lot of work going on in the background for the SNP group to be seeing what the effect of that would be. I think they will not be looked upon kindly by the Scottish electorate. So they've got a lot of thinking to do about this. What will the Lib Dems do? They will do whatever they think is most advantageous for them. I'm not as convinced that we'll have a complete unionist coalition against the SNP as we have had before on many occasions this time round. We're a year and a half out from the next Scottish Parliament election. Labour thought they were going to be on a high all the way through that. Turns out they're not. That by-election result in Dundee the other day was very, very interesting. Must have given them cause for real concern and also cause for rethinking their position. So, I don't know if I've answered your question, Brian, because I can't quite remember what it was. But I don't think it's as clear-cut as the Better Together campaign against the Nats as it has been in the past.
Yeah.
Well, I don't think I'm very good at asking very pointed questions about the heart of the matter, so I'm quite happy for you to answer any question that you want, and you too, Drew. I won't be offended.
I just want to come back in. I think there's still a pro-independence majority in the Scottish Parliament. There's not an SNP majority in the Scottish Parliament.
Okay, understood. Thank you.
And I think when it comes to the budget, there are some difficult decisions that are going to have to be made. I'm not in elected politics anymore, so I would say that there are things that will have to be addressed differently in the future, I believe, in terms of how the SNP government goes about trying to do the best it can to deliver for Scotland. I think we've done many laudable things over the past number of years to mitigate cuts that have come out of Westminster. And they've been the right things to do. Keeping children out of poverty is the right thing to do. Building council houses and homes for rent and stopping the sale of council houses has been the right thing to do. Mitigating the bedroom tax has been the right thing to do, but they're bad politics. And the problem we have now is that people look to the Scottish government to mitigate every single cut that comes out of Westminster. And the trouble is that can't be done. So who becomes the bad guy when that happens? And it's the sitting government. Now, people have got a right to demand of their government, of the devolved government, that they make choices, spending choices that they should make. And that's absolutely correct in democracy. But you don't necessarily get the right plaudits for doing the right things at times when cuts are having to be made elsewhere. And it's a difficult political environment. And it doesn't have to be this way. What we have is a situation at Westminster where Rachel Reeves is following fiscal rules set up by the Tories. Now, this is a so-called Labour government that should be looking towards the social contract in a much better way. It should be looking to invest in UK infrastructure from its perspective there at Westminster. It should be looking to get the economy going in a meaningful way. But instead, it's failed to do that, and it's followed these fiscal rules. And I mentioned Paul Johnson at the Institute for Fiscal Studies earlier. He's described them quite rightly as daft. I've described them in Parliament as daft as well, because when you keep sucking the investment out of the infrastructure, out of communities, out of the economy, yes, some other people will get a bit more, but the vast majority will lose out over a longer period of time, and it becomes harder to rebuild. You have to compare and contrast with those countries, very nearby countries, that have got the ability to make choices to invest. And one of them, quite glaringly, is Ireland. Independent Ireland is sitting on an €8 billion surplus from last year. They're going to grow faster with lower inflation than the UK. And I think it was Dr. Ed Casey, who's from the Financial Advisory Council in Ireland, said that Ireland doesn't really have any many financial constraints in terms of how it moves forward. So they're able to do a whole lot of things that we just can't do here in Scotland. And I think we've got to rebuild political trust, because one of the big issues that we have across Scotland, I believe it's across the UK, is that people are just fed up with politics and politicians, and they have a real lack of trust. And I think when you look at some of the results of turnout in recent elections, and particularly in by-elections, they're scandalously low, and that's a problem that we've all got to try and tackle.
Drew, thanks. There's a lot to unpack there. You kind of like touched on what Linda said. Linda, you said that you hope that the SNP are doing hard work now about the budget, and yeah, and Drew, you, and now I've lost my thread.
Can I just say, Brian, Drew mentioned a really interesting thing, which is the social contract. And and the SNP have always gone big in this. Those who are elected have a social contract with the people that they serve. And I think, one of the things that Ireland showed in their budget last week was, yes, they have the surpluses that, Ireland's made a surplus, the UK is at a huge loss. I mean, my goodness. But what Ireland did with that surplus was they strengthened the social contract with the people they serve. They made changes to unemployment payment, for example. And that's what those of us who so wish for independence, that's what we want to be able to do in Scotland, to serve people, to be true representatives of what people want, what people need, and have that social contract that says, yes, we are actually all in this together. It's not just a phrase that gets thrown out whenever times are hard and millionaires want to pretend they're down there with the folks. For it to be real, and Scotland as a small independent nation like Ireland could achieve that. And the frustration of those of us who really know what could be done in trying to convince others to really have the confidence to move forward that way. And as a closer, Ireland doesn't have anything like the resources that Scotland has, and it would have control of as an independent nation.
Yeah, absolutely, Linda. I mean, as a single person, I was quite surprised, very shocked almost to see that in Ireland, if you're a single person, they've increased the benefits that you get, and I don't get any benefits here as a single person. And but Drew, we're absolutely over time on this, but I just really want to come back really quickly to. You touched on something that Linda said about. Linda hoped that the SNP and Holyrood were already working hard on the budget and when it is announced and what they're going to include. I'm intrigued to find out what you think should or shouldn't be, or what you hope is going to be in there. But I'm actually more interested is, because you were in Westminster and you watched previous Westminster budgets unfold, what do you think changes could be made to the Westminster system to make it easier for the devolved governments? Have you got any ideas? And also, also, maybe more importantly, it sounded like what you were saying was that when the Scottish Government should take responsibility, which sounds like you're almost in the same lane as unionists when they say you can't just blame Westminster when you have to make cuts, you made those choices. Have I kind of over-egged that point?
Yeah, I think you have over-egged it a bit, and I'll explain exactly what I mean. I think it's absolutely right to do the right things. Politics isn't an exact science, and when you're elected in politics, the first thing that you should do is always try, in my view, to do the right thing. So if that means keeping children out of poverty, you absolutely should keep children out of poverty. You should stretch every sinew to do it. If that means housing people, you should stretch every sinew to house people. You should try and help people. The point I was making is that it's not always politics that is that gets you votes, because other things get cancelled, and those because of the fact you're making those choices. Very, very clearly, and this is absolutely fundamental, Scotland has largely a fixed budget. Linda mentioned it'd be great to have borrowing powers extended, for example, so that we can make more choices, but we can't do that in Scotland. We don't have that ability. So what we are, relying on is a budget that comes out of Westminster, which is why everybody holds their breath to see what Rachel Reeves is going to bring forward. And what Rachel Reeves should bring forward is investment in the things that are important to people. So, if you want to build more houses, you should invest in house building across the UK so that the consequentials are able to come down into our capital spend. If she wants to, and what she should do, because it's things that people want, she should be investing in, the National Health Service and into care, into all of the things that are going to make a difference and the things that we really need to tackle. She should be investing much more in the transition to our green future. All of those things, that are things that have been well discussed, well rehearsed. Everybody knows they are the right choices to make, but the indications are that she won't do that. She'll stick largely to fiscal rules. Now, we also know that the realpolitik of Westminster, because she needs some good things to take back to her supporters, means that she'll try and tinker with the rules a bit, and hopefully that will free up a bit of consequential cash for Scotland. But it's still a really, really difficult position for devolution that we've been manoeuvred into, in terms of trying to continually mitigate Westminster cuts. Now, what I was saying about responsibility earlier is it's everybody's right in a democracy to point the finger at the decision maker about how you make a budget. But that budget is based on the choices that you have available to you. And more as we go forward, the choices that are available to Scotland are becoming more and more limited. And the fact is that we need to get back to a discussion with people about what real change, not just the change that was put forward in an election campaign, which turns out to be no change at all, but what real change they want to see into the future. And, if we're looking at a discussion over what Scotland could be, that's what we really need to get into. Now, do I have all the answers on that? No. Will I continue to work on trying to get the answers for that? Absolutely. And I'll speak to anybody in terms of how we make a better Scotland into the future. And I'll work with people in order to get the right things done. But it's a very difficult situation. We shouldn't just accept what Westminster is doing. Absolutely not. But what we do have to do is say, look, these are the conditions that we find ourselves in, and this is the state of play that determines the choices that we make. And I don't think we've been clear enough in Scotland about saying that's the background that we work on.
Thank you, Drew. And speaking of which, I mean, you talked about poverty, and those choices were the right choices to make. And it's often spoken about in relation to the housing emergency, which is everyone agrees is currently happening in Scotland. So there's going to be a £22 million investment into a scheme to increase investment into affordable homes to deliver more housing in Scotland as part of Scotland's charitable bond programme. Scottish Government's provided funding to issue 2 new bonds via finance intermediary Alia to housing providers Link and to Cairn Housing Association to provide support for more than 150 new homes. The programme's been running since 2014 and provides loans to social landlords to construct new affordable homes, with the latest interest being reinvested by the Scottish Government into the affordable. Sorry, this is very boring, but the latest extension was. So there's been an announcement today about another 19.5 million going into housing for Scotland. The nub of the matter is, let me just get my bearings here, the Scottish Government has homeless numbers in Scotland make no mention of the impact of the UK government spending decisions. Scottish Government has delivered 133,000 affordable homes since 2007, 40% more per head of population in England and 70% more per head of population than Wales. What is the root cause of the housing emergency? This week, the Scottish Government has announced a £41.8 million investment in affordable homes. What more can be done? So, Drew, would you want to sort of build on what you've said about poverty eradication in Scotland?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, one of the things that the Scottish Government did that has kind of almost slipped away into the mists of the political discourse is we cancelled the sale of council houses in order to retain stock in Scotland and make sure that people had more houses for social rent. That's a really important step in this whole process, and we need to build up more stock. And of course, we need to invest more money. And when the people are calling on the Scottish Government to do more. Again, that's their right to do that. And they're looking at the primary source of delivery for that when they're asking for that to be done. But I think there's been, in comparative terms, you've just laid out a stunning success in terms of delivering affordable houses. Now, is it enough? No, it's nowhere near enough. But you can only do what you can do within the constraints of the budget situation that we just outlined. We absolutely need to do more, but in order to do that, as I referred to, we need to see more money coming into the system. That home building builds business, it helps the supply chain, it creates jobs, and in itself it reduces poverty and reliance on other kinds of support as well. So, these are good things to do. These are the right things to do. UK politics at the moment isn't calibrated to deal with that in the way that it should. And what we've got to do is, I think, keep making the message that, yes, we can do these things, but we want to do more. And perhaps part of the answer is to set out the vision of what we could do if the resources were correctly allocated in order to make sure that we could build the kinds of numbers that we need.
Thank you, Drew. Just checking what time we're meant to finish there. Linda, have we come to you yet on this even?
No, you haven't.
What would you like to say? I'm sorry about that really garbled summary at the beginning there. I don't know if you can rescue anything from it.
Well, what I would say, one of the questions you asked is what was the root cause, and I would go back to one of the discussions we had earlier. The root cause is underinvestment for decades. When you look back at the pride that was Scotland's council housing stock post-war, particularly through Wheatley, we built some cracking public housing in Scotland. We had a higher proportion of public housing than anywhere else in the UK, but we did it. We used really good standards, some great houses. Along came the right to buy by Margaret Thatcher with ridiculous discounts and ridiculous rules. And it was all the good housing stock that was sold off. People bought the houses in Knightswood, the houses in Kings Park. So what then happened was that council housing started to get a bit stigmatised, unfortunately. But as well, the other thing about that people don't talk about wasn't just the right to buy, it was the fact that when councils had to sell their stock, they weren't allowed to reinvest the money that they got for it into further public housing because it was all about home ownership. And then Labour colluded in all this as well. People forget that the Labour Lib Dem administration in Scotland extended the right to buy to housing associations. So when we came in and we stopped the right to buy, we did a really good thing. But by that time, public housing was getting marginalised, it was getting stigmatised, and the whole concept of home ownership has been what people aspire to. That is the root cause way back, underinvestment for generations and the right to buy. Now, the SNP's affordable housing record is a good one in comparison to the rest of the UK. And I think it's quite sad that the housing organisations and agencies such as Shelter, for example, don't recognise that. I can understand why they're lobbying for more money. I can understand when they say, but we're in Scotland, so it's the Scottish Government we're having a go at. What does the rest of the UK matter? But it does matter, because any good analysis of the situation would show that the SNP government has actually done a good job against all circumstances. And what I also find quite interesting is that they're never averse to quoting the UK if they see something that they think's good and start hammering the Scottish Government to do it here as well. So they're very selective in how they choose to report. And I don't think actually it serves their cause very well.
Thank you, Linda. I'm going to move on to the next topic, which is the Scottish Constitution. So 4 leading UK academics have joined forces to warn the UK government that its commitment to resetting relations with the devolved government cannot be met without addressing the impact of the United Kingdom Internal Market Act, or the UKMA, I'm not going to call it that, the Internal Market Act. But there's also been recently a previous report on Scotland's constitution, which I think I'd like to tackle first so we don't run out of time on this, which said that the Secretary of State for Scotland should decide when a second Indie ref can happen. This, forgive me because I've failed to find, apologies to the authors of this report, but Kezia Dugdale was one of them, and Stephen Noon, thank you, is the second. Kezia Dugdale and Stephen Noon, the authors of this report, admitted that they had probably produced something that both pro-independence and pro-union supporters would be unhappy with. Unionists would be unhappy because it would set out a clear and defined path to an independence referendum and would run against the Independence Brigade's call of, the Unionist brigade of You Lost, Get Over It. I'm getting this mixed up again. Pro-Indie supporters would be unhappy because it would hand the power for the second referendum directly to Westminster, as if Westminster doesn't have enough power over Scotland already. So tell me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like a Scottish version of the Good Friday Agreement. And I think it was Kenny Farquharson who said on a debate night on STV that maybe BBC, that maybe something positive would come out of it for both sides, both independence and unionist sides, of this proposal. For unionists, it dismantles the argument that Scotland's being denied democracy, which it is at the moment, but nationalists would get a clear promise from Westminster that an independence referendum will happen. And when Stephen Flynn later said that for it to happen, both sides would have to be brave. And am I right in saying that that sounds like Stephen Flynn would kind of basically agrees with the premise to some extent, because he didn't say that he lacks the bravery. So, Linda, my question to you, where do you stand on this? Would it be, should the power go to Westminster, or should it stay closer to home in Scotland? And whichever one who
it's a
wins.
really interesting question. It's a big debate, this one. I can see both sides of it, actually. And I'm going to start sounding like a Liberal Democrat here, Brian. I'm terribly sorry. But on the one hand, I can understand why there would be a view that we should have the same sort of deal in place as in Northern Ireland in terms of a referendum. I can understand the view that it would be clear cut that there is a democratic process that should be followed. Should it appear, I can't remember the exact wording, but should it appear that there is a majority for independence? In the case of Northern Ireland, of course, it would be unity with Ireland. Should it appear so, that referendum should be granted? So I can understand that. But on the other hand, I can also understand the aversion to handing control over to the Secretary of State for Scotland, who is a puppet of Westminster. Because then you get back to that thing about the should it appear so, or should the Secretary of State believe that? And that gets quite difficult. So I certainly think it's something that is worthy of discussion. I mean, when I read the stuff that Stephen Noon and Kezia Dugdale had put forward, my first reaction was a complete aversion to the idea. But then I started to try and think logically about it. So I think the discussion is probably worth having, but there's a bit of presumption of fairness on behalf of a UK government if you were actually to have it implemented. Then you go to the other side of, well, if you don't have that, what actually do we have at the moment that is concrete that says we will have to have a referendum? So the jury's out for me on that. Worthy of further discussion, further development perhaps, with some kind of detail put in place that would make this more feasible and more palatable.
Thank you, Linda. So, Drew, you were I keep saying you were in the House. I mean, admittedly, it was a previous Tory administrations. We've now got a Labour administration. But as Linda hinted at, do you think Westminster could be trusted with the power to decide when an independence referendum should happen? Northern Ireland, 8 years is a generation. In Scotland, it's already 10 years since the previous independence referendum. Can they be trusted?
Yeah, it's Yeah, I mean, Linda said it's a really interesting discussion, and I think part of the issue for people in Scotland in the pro-independence camp is that they want the discussion to move on to how to do that. And you're absolutely right to point out that the difference between, I think, what's proposed and what actually exists under the Good Friday Agreement is that right that is in there for the every 7 or 8 years. Uh, for that to be re-examined if that was the case. So, it doesn't have to be a one-off event as it seems to have happened in Scotland. And then, when the game changes, you're not allowed to revisit it. So it's a difficult thing. I mean, I notice you've picked the Internal Market Act. Well, that is a piece of legislation which I measurably didn't like. It got me banned from the House of Commons, the Internal Market bill discussion. So it is one of these things where we've seen the power over Scotland, over its ability to function properly even as a devolved government, hacked away by that act. It's a bad act. I believe it's a bad act for unionists as much as for pro-independence supporters as well. I've always felt that it was one of these things that was absolutely typical at the time of that government, a typical hammer to try and break some nuts in terms of how it was taken forward. It is badly constructed, and it's ultimately centralizes power in a way that is absolutely against the principles of devolution. And I think ultimately the follow through from that will be that it's against the principles of unionism as well, because it really doesn't set that in the light that I think it should do. So it is a difficult situation. How do you redress it? I do think we need to have a conversation. We do need to try and get to some place where there is a mechanism we can take forward, because I think that's become the discussion now. But let's not forget in the background that this is about having a better Scotland into the future. And really, the most powerful arguments that we can make are what could we do differently, and how are things being done differently in other countries just now. We start to touch on that occasionally, but we don't follow through on it enough, and we really don't explain to the Scottish people what they're, what the choices that are being made for them are actually resulting in compared to what they could be if they're making their own choices.
Thank you, Drew. And Linda, this report by Glasgow University, 4 academics, argued that the Internal Market Acts undermine the authority of devolved institutions. That report seemed quite sympathetic to the devolved institutions and more or less said that it's not their fault, but they would have to work with Westminster to kind of repair the damage. But kind of just, again, I'm going to get accused of making it treating this glibly, but do you think Westminster can be trusted to work with devolved governments? Is Starmer's government going to repair previous damages caused by Tory governments? I'll be quiet now and let you say.
Well, I mean, the Internal Market Act is appalling. What it allows, the complete overruling of anything the devolved administrations want to do, if Westminster so chooses, it's just not democratic at all. So certainly the government that put that in place could not be trusted. And I would say that any UK government that doesn't make changes to that cannot be trusted either. So it's interesting. I mean, the academics that wrote it, I think what they have done is put in academic terms and laid out clearly what so many people have recognised is wrong with this act in terms of how it interacts with devolution. So there's an awful lot here. Now, one of the things that has been mooted of late, and John Swinney, as leader of the SNP, seems to have accepted, is the potential of a further democratic convention, like was had before. So these are all things that should be properly discussed if that goes forward. Constitutional convention, sorry. So there's a lot in the mix. There's this stuff that Kezia Dugdale and Stephen Noon came up with. There's the Internal Market Act, which I believe to be the really major, and we haven't seen half of what a UK government can make of that yet. So all these things would have to be discussed about the way forward. But the bottom line is there has to be a way to say that if the people of Scotland show that they wish independence, there should be a way of having that granted. Because self-determination is something that is recognised by the United Nations, it's recognised by international law, and Scotland at the moment is lacking a way forward in that. So that has to be the ultimate goal. You know, for many of us, the ultimate goal is independence, of course it is. But the goal that we have to go to now is a way to be able to ask the people of Scotland how they want their constitutional future to be. And if that is independence, fine. See, if it isn't independence, well, those of us who passionately believe in it would have to bite our lip and start all over again, because that's what we would do. But it is the right to decide, which we don't have currently in Scotland, that is sadly lacking in any of these discussions.
Thank you, Linda. Again, Drew, I'm just going to ask you to draw on your experience of working in Westminster. Is there anything that you think could be done to improve the Scottish Constitution? I'm kind of, this might be a bit harebrained and my colleagues are probably going to be rolling their eyes now, but you know how the boundaries in Scotland were recently redrawn for elections, and despite that, we've still got the Highlands and Islands, and the First Minister and Kate Forbes are going to be going to the Highlands and Islands this week for a convention up to Murray and Lerwick. Do you think this thing about just trying to make all the constituencies have roughly the same number of people living there ends up with sparsely populated, enormous, single sparsely populated constituencies? Should we maybe have a different metric and break those down and have smaller, some of them less populated, but some way of giving them equal say? Can we get that from Westminster, or does that need independence?
Well, I'm very glad that since you posed that question, that I made the point before the election that the boundary changes were a bad idea, because obviously it didn't help me in the end in terms of my own election. So, but having said that, the point is pretty simple. There are protected population areas already in the UK Parliament. The Western Isles, Orkney and Shetland are much, much lower. They didn't have to subscribe to the population figures that were put forward by the UK government and the Boundary Commission in terms of trying to equalise this out. It is a democratic deficit. Again, if you believe in the future of the Union, then I think they're a really bad idea, just as much as I think they're a bad idea as somebody who believes in independence, because what they've done is they've made it far more difficult for MPs in the Highlands to actually represent their constituencies properly. You have a ridiculous size of constituencies and a real different mix of people within them, and I don't think that sets the UK Parliament in a good light in terms of its representation. There has to be a way to have a better situation for Scotland going forward. Again, Linda said there are those of us who obviously believe in independence and believe that's the best future for Scotland. Until we get that mechanism that she described, we've got to make sure that we do what we can to get the best choices for Scotland just now. And I would say that one of the questions we've got to ask of those people who believe in the future of the Union is how are these changes, how are these economic choices, how is the redrawing of the boundary, how is the fact that we are paying the highest electricity charges in the UK. I'm sitting in the Highlands and Islands where the standing charges are higher than 50% higher than in London. How is that benefiting people across Scotland? So those are questions that I don't think we're asking enough. And I think we have to say, right, if your vision is different from ours, let's hear what that positive case is, because too often we allow people just to say, no, you can't do that, as opposed to saying, right, well, what is the benefit? Why aren't we pushing that more? What is the benefits here that you want to sell us? Because, maybe we're there to be persuaded. Not my case, but others might be.
Thank you, Drew. Linda, we're almost out of time, but I finished early on Friday night, so I'm going to be cheeky and with your permission, pinch a couple of minutes just to give you an opportunity. So if you live in the Highlands and Islands, you're doubly what's the word, punished, because your MP is the furthest away from Westminster than anywhere else in the UK, and your MSP has got the biggest council or constituency to have to cross for surgeries and MPs as well. Do you think the constituencies should be smaller for the Scottish, to make things easier and better?
Yeah, I mean, I was very, very fortunate when I represented East Kilbride in the Scottish Parliament, Brian, because it was done in that population thing, out with the exceptions that Drew spoke about. All I had was the town of East Kilbride and the wee posh enclave that is just outside it, Thornton Hall. So I considered myself very fortunate because it was a small contained area that I didn't have to travel much at all. My office was accessible to anybody that lived in the constituency. Um, and I used to look at, some of my colleagues up in the Highlands and Islands, and Argyll is, another example with all the islands and stuff. How on earth do you really build up relationships? I'm not talking about individual constituents, I'm talking about community groups and all the different components of a constituency. Really hard. So, yeah, I think that there is a case for more. I know people grew at the idea of having more elected members, but I've never thought that the additional member system in Holyrood has been the ideal way forward, the ideal form of representation, the way it's constituted. So I would like to see more of the ability to have a closer link with the groups and people in a constituency. So yes, that would suggest to me that there are constituencies in Scotland that could be better put together with more direct links.
Thank you, Linda. I'll try and be really quick so you can get back to your weekend both. But you're absolutely right. And another punishment then is, I remember Ian Blackford and his colleagues from the Highlands and Islands would often then be highlighted and in a negative way for having submitted the most expenses, but they've travelled the furthest. Anyway, thank you both. Just before we go, so I had to make my way through Glasgow city centre. The place is absolutely heaving with the Great Scottish Run. The aroma of Raljecks was heavy in the air. There were 23 McGill's Scottish buses for the baggage of runners, all lined up behind George Square. It's quite impressive. I just wanted to wish everybody in the Great Scottish Run good luck. And anyway, thank you, Drew. Thank you, Linda, for your patience and for letting us run over.
Pleasure.
We'll get that's it for this week's Full Scottish. But before we go, we just want to remind you that here at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. To everyone who has donated and to everybody who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, we thank you very much. We now face costs of over £4,000 every month, but we receive donations of around £2,500, for which we're extremely grateful. But we urgently need more regular subscribers, but we need to clear our debts as well. We're at crisis point and we really need your donations right now to be able to pay our bills and to survive. You know that our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you could afford even £5 a month, we know that's a lot, but please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter and please donate whatever you can. But once again, thank you to my guests, to you, Linda, and to you, Drew. And we'll be back again next week with Scotland at 7. Good night. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.